September 11th, 1931. 3:22 a.m. The Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant, Coney Island, Brooklyn. Joe, the boss Masseria, lies face down on the checkered linoleum floor, 4 bullet holes forming a tight pattern across his back, a 5th through the base of his skull. His right hand still clutches the ace of diamonds from the card game he'd been playing moments before. Blood pools around the expensive Italian leather shoes he'd had custom-made in Naples. The restaurant smells of gunpowder, garlic, and the Chianti that spilled when the table overturned. In his pockets, investigators will find $4,000 in cash, a diamond pinky ring worth another $3,000, and a handwritten list of names. 23 names, all Sicilian, all marked for death in Masseria's ongoing war against Salvatore Maranzano's faction. What investigators won't find, because it doesn't exist yet, is the response to that list. A counter-purge so comprehensive, so ruthless, so perfectly coordinated, that it will reshape American organized crime for the next 60 years. 40 bosses. 40 men who built the old mafia, who brought the code of omertà from Sicily, who believed power flowed from Sicilian bloodlines and old-world traditions. 40 men who, in the span of 48 hours following Masseria's execution, will die in barber chairs, restaurants, hotel rooms, and moving cars across New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. The man who orchestrated this purge isn't Sicilian. He's a Neapolitan immigrant named Salvatore Lucania, who by 1931 has Americanized himself into something new. Charles Lucky Luciano, 34 years old, 5th grade education, and the most dangerous strategic mind the Underworld has ever produced. This isn't just murder. This is revolution. And it begins with the sound of gunfire in a Coney Island restaurant. 18 months earlier, March 1930. The Castellamarese War, named after the Sicilian town that produced many of its key players, had been bleeding New York's Italian underworld dry for over a year. On one side, Joe Masseria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, controlled bootlegging operations across Manhattan and Brooklyn. On the other, Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian immigrant with ambitions to recreate the old mafia structure in America, commanded loyalty from newer immigrants and traditionalists. Bodies were dropping weekly. Bootleggers, numbers, runners, enforcers, men shot in the street, garroted in basements, dumped in the East River with their throats cut. The violence was costing everyone money. Speakeasies were getting raided because the police, overwhelmed by mob murders, were cracking down indiscriminately. Shipments from Canada were being intercepted. Territories that had been profitable were turning into war zones. Lucky Luciano was Masseria's second-in-command, but he saw the war with clear eyes. Both bosses were dinosaurs fighting over a dying world. Masseria believed in the old ways, Sicilians only, blood feuds, personal vendettas. Maranzano was even worse, obsessed with recreating the rigid hierarchies of the Sicilian mafia, complete with ceremonial oaths and feudal obligations. Luciano had different ideas. He'd grown up on the Lower East Side, not in some Sicilian village. He'd learned business from Meyer Lansky, a Jew from Poland. He'd worked with Frank Costello, an Italian from Calabria. He'd made money with Arnold Rothstein, who'd taught him that crime was business, not blood sport. The idea that you couldn't work with someone because they were born in the wrong town, spoke the wrong dialect, or weren't Sicilian seemed insane to Luciano. More importantly, prohibition was making everyone rich. Bootleg liquor was flowing into America by the millions of gallons. Every speakeasy, every nightclub, every corner store selling rot-gut gin represented profit. The only thing stopping that profit from growing exponentially was the tribal warfare tearing the underworld apart. So Luciano made a decision that would have gotten him killed if anyone in Masseria's organization discovered it. He reached out to Salvatore Maranzano through intermediaries. The message was simple. This war benefits no one except the undertakers and the cops. We end it, or we all go broke burying each other. The first meeting happened in a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, neutral territory controlled by Abner Longy Zwillman. Luciano brought Meyer Lansky and Vito Genovese. Maranzano brought Joe Bonanno and Tommy Lucchese. They talked for 6 hours, circling the fundamental problem. Neither Masseria nor Maranzano would accept anything less than total dominance. That's when Luciano proposed what would later be called the solution. Both old bosses had to go. Not just defeated, eliminated. Completely. Permanently. And not just them, but the entire generation of Mustache Petes, the old-timers who clung to Sicilian traditions, who refused to work with other ethnic groups, who saw crime as a matter of honor rather than profit. Maranzano agreed in principle, but with a caveat. He would become the new boss of bosses after Masseria's death. Luciano would be his second in command, given control of Masseria's operations. The war would end, the old guard would be purged, and a new structure, one Maranzano was already calling the Commission, would govern organized crime in America. Luciano shook on it, knowing he'd just signed Maranzano's death warrant along with Masseria's. But first things first. The first execution, April 15th, 1931. Masseria died exactly as Luciano planned. Over lunch, relaxed, unsuspecting. Luciano had suggested the Nuova Villa Tamaro, a favorite restaurant of Masseria's, ostensibly to discuss strategy for the war. They ate well. Pasta with clam sauce, veal, red wine. After the meal, they played cards. Masseria was winning, which put him in good spirits. At 3:20 p.m., Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. 60 seconds later, 4 men walked through the restaurant's front door. Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. They moved with choreographed precision. 5 shots, 4 seconds. Masseria dead before his body hit the floor. Luciano emerged from the bathroom, surveyed the scene with apparent shock, and called the police himself. His story was simple. He'd been in the restroom, heard gunshots, came out to find his boss murdered. No, he hadn't seen the killers. No, he had no idea who might want Joe Masseria dead, besides half of New York. The police, who had their own suspicions but no evidence, let him go. Within hours, Luciano was meeting with Salvatore Maranzano in a Bronx social club, officially pledging his loyalty to the new boss of bosses. The Castellamarese War was over. Maranzano had won. Or so everyone believed. The reorganization, April to September, 1931. Maranzano moved quickly to consolidate power. He organized a meeting of every major Italian mobster in New York, over 500 men, at a hall in the Bronx. There, he outlined his vision. The American Mafia would mirror the Roman legions he'd studied obsessively. There would be families, each led by a boss. Each boss would have an underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers. Everyone would answer to Maranzano as capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He divided New York into 5 families, his own, plus organizations led by Lucky Luciano, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Galliano, and Joe Bonanno. Each family would control specific territories and rackets. Disputes would be settled through Maranzano's mediation. The old chaos would give way to Roman order. The problem was that Maranzano actually believed his own propaganda. He saw himself as a Caesar, the other bosses as his subjects. He demanded tribute, cash payments from each family's earnings. He issued orders, not suggestions. He began planning to eliminate anyone who might challenge him, starting with the most dangerous threats. Lucky Luciano and his Jewish partners, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Luciano learned about the hit through Tommy Lucchese, one of Maranzano's own captains, who saw which way the wind was blowing. Maranzano had hired Vincent Mad Dog Call, an Irish gunman with a reputation for indiscriminate violence, to kill Luciano, Genovese, Costello, and several others. The hit was scheduled for September 13, 1931. Luciano had 2 days to move. What he did in those 48 hours would fundamentally alter American organized crime. The Purge, September 10 to 12, 1931. Luciano called an emergency meeting with his inner circle: Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Albert Anastasia. The decision was unanimous. Maranzano had to die immediately. But killing just Maranzano wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. His faction, the Castellamarese loyalists, the Sicilian traditionalists, the old guard bosses across the country who believed in the boss of bosses concept, would simply find a new leader and continue the cycle. The solution required thinking bigger. Lansky, whose analytical mind saw patterns others missed, proposed the unthinkable: simultaneous hits on every major mustache Pete in America. Every boss who believed in the old ways, who rejected cooperation with non-Italians, who would fight to preserve the traditional mafia structure. Eliminate them all at once, leave no one to carry the torch. The logistics were staggering. They had less than 72 hours to identify targets across 6 states, coordinate hit teams, ensure operational security, and execute a plan that would make the St. Valentine's Day massacre look like a schoolyard fight. But Luciano had been building toward this moment for months. He'd cultivated relationships with younger mobsters in every major city, men like Al Capone's people in Chicago, the Purple Gang in Detroit, the La Zia organization in Kansas City. Men who saw crime as business, not tradition. Meyer Lansky coordinated communications, using a network of payphones and coded telegrams. Bugsy Siegel organized the New York hit teams. Frank Costello handled political cover, making sure the police and politicians who were on the payroll stayed quiet. Vito Genovese managed logistics, weapons, getaway cars, safe houses. The target list was comprehensive. In New York alone, Salvatore Maranzano, Joseph Profaci's top lieutenants, several Castellamarese captains who'd been loyal to the old regime. In Chicago, 3 Capone rivals who'd been agitating for a Sicilian-only organization. In Detroit, 5 Purple Gang leaders who'd refused to work with Italians. In Philadelphia, Newark, Buffalo, and smaller cities, local bosses who clung to old-world traditions. 40 names, 40 death sentences, 48 hours to make it happen. September 10th, 1931. The first wave. The Purge began in Chicago. At 11:47 a.m., 3 men entered a barbershop on South Halsted Street. Giuseppe "Joey" Batters Ferrari, a 48-year-old boss who'd been demanding that the Chicago outfit adopt Maranzano's family structure, was getting a shave. The barber had just applied hot towels to Ferrari's face when the first shotgun blast took off the top of his head. 2 more hits followed within an hour. Pietro Marzano shot in his car at a traffic light. Salvatore Di Meo garroted in a warehouse bathroom. Detroit followed suit. The Purple Gang, predominantly Jewish, but with several Italian members who advocated for Sicilian separatism, lost 5 men between noon and 6 p.m. 1 was pushed off a building. 2 were shot in a restaurant. 2 more disappeared entirely. Their bodies never recovered. In Philadelphia, 3 bosses died before midnight. In Newark, 2. In Buffalo, 4. Each hit was designed to look random, unconnected. A robbery gone wrong, a personal vendetta, a business dispute. Local police departments, already overwhelmed by prohibition-related crime, didn't connect the dots. But the Underworld knew. By midnight September 10th, every major mob organization in America understood something unprecedented was happening. The old guard was being systematically eliminated. September 11, 1931, Maranzano. Lucky Luciano woke at 6 a.m. in a safe house in Queens. He'd slept 3 hours in the past 2 days. Meyer Lansky arrived with coffee and the overnight reports. 23 confirmed kills, 4 more probable, 0 arrests, and most critically, Maranzano still alive and increasingly paranoid. Maranzano had barricaded himself in his office at 230 Park Avenue, surrounded by guards. He'd canceled the hit on Luciano, more concerned now with his own survival. But he was still dangerous, still had loyal soldiers, still represented the old order that needed to die. Lansky proposed a solution that was elegant in its simplicity. They'd use Maranzano's paranoia against him. At 2 p.m., a phone call reached Maranzano's office. The caller identified himself as an IRS agent, said there were irregularities in Maranzano's tax filings, requested a meeting immediately to avoid formal charges. Maranzano, already terrified of federal prosecution after watching Al Capone go down for tax evasion, agreed. At 3:20 p.m., almost exactly 24 hours after Masseria's death, a detail Luciano appreciated. 4 men in suits entered Maranzano's office building. They flashed federal badges at the guards outside. Inside the office, they identified themselves as IRS agents, asked Maranzano to clarify some documents. When Maranzano turned to his filing cabinet, they drew weapons. The execution was professional. 6 shots, 2 knives to make sure. Maranzano dead in his own office. The killers, actually Jewish mobsters hired by Lansky, not Italian, which meant they couldn't be traced through normal underworld channels, walked out calmly, badges still visible, looking like federal agents leaving a routine interview. Maranzano's guards found him 10 minutes later. By then, the killers were in 3 different states. September 11 to 12, 1931. The final wave. With Maranzano dead, the remaining targets became easier. Old guard bosses who might have rallied to avenge the boss of bosses instead went into hiding, making them vulnerable. Between 6 p.m. September 11th and midnight September 12th, another 17 bosses died. Some went quietly. Carlo Gambino's predecessor, shot while walking his dog. Others fought. Tommy Reyna's loyalists engaged in a brief shootout in the Bronx that left 3 dead on each side. A few managed to flee. 5 bosses abandoned their operations and ran to Italy, never to return. By dawn, September 13th, when Maranzano had originally planned to kill Luciano, the purge was complete. 40 bosses dead. The old mafia structure dismantled. Every major city's underworld leadership decapitated and replaced with younger, more pragmatic men who understood that crime was business. The police, FBI, and newspapers were baffled. They documented a wave of violence, but couldn't establish motive or pattern. Theories ranged from a massive gang war to a coordinated law enforcement operation gone wrong. The truth, that organized crime had just reorganized itself, wouldn't become clear for decades. The Commission, October 1931. 3 weeks after the purge, Lucky Luciano convened a meeting in a suite at Chicago's Congress Hotel. Present were the heads of the 5 New York families, plus representatives from Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Kansas City. Also present, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, representing Jewish organized crime. Frank Costello brought political connections. Arnold Rothstein's former associates represented gambling interests. Luciano laid out the new structure, the one he'd been planning since before Masseria's death. There would be no boss of bosses. Instead, a commission, 7 to 9 members representing major crime families and ethnic organizations. Disputes would be settled by majority vote. New rackets would be divided fairly. Killing a boss without commission approval would mean death. Most importantly, there would be no ethnic restrictions. Jews could work with Italians, Irish with Jews. What mattered was profit, not bloodline. The old Sicilian traditions were dead, buried in the same graves as the Mustache Pete's. The vote was unanimous. The commission was born. The aftermath. Lucky Luciano never held an official title grander than boss of one of New York's families. But everyone understood he was first among equals on the commission. He'd proven his strategic brilliance, his ruthlessness, and his ability to see beyond tribal warfare to the business possibilities of organized cooperation. The Purge itself became legend, though the exact number of dead remained disputed. Some historians claim 30 victims, others 60. The true number, 40 confirmed kills across 6 states in 48 hours, wasn't documented until decades later, when FBI surveillance and informants reconstructed the events. The commission structure Luciano created lasted, in various forms, until the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s. It proved remarkably resilient, governing billions of dollars in illegal activity, mediating countless disputes, and maintaining a level of organization unprecedented in criminal history. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. Luciano had eliminated 40 men for clinging to tradition, then created his own tradition that would govern the underworld for 50 years. The difference was that his tradition was based on pragmatism, not nostalgia, on profit, not honor, on American innovation, not Sicilian custom. The legacy September 1931 marked the end of the old mafia and the birth of modern organized crime. The Mustache Pete's, with their blood oaths and Sicilian codes, were replaced by businessmen who happened to use violence as a tool rather than a way of life. The commission model spread beyond New York, influencing organized crime structures worldwide. Lucky Luciano himself would eventually fall, convicted on prostitution charges in 1936, in what many historians consider a politically motivated prosecution. He'd served 10 years before being released and deported to Italy, where he died in 1962. But his creation outlived him by decades. The 40 bosses who died in those 48 hours became footnotes in history, their names remembered only by scholars and organized crime enthusiasts. Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the titans whose war nearly destroyed New York's underworld, are remembered primarily as the men Lucky Luciano killed to create something new. The Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant closed 6 months after Masseria's murder, unable to overcome the notoriety. The building where Maranzano died now houses a law firm. The barbershops, warehouses, and street corners, where 40 men met their violent ends, have been demolished or repurposed, their bloody history forgotten by everyone except those who understand what happened in September 1931. What remains is the structure, the commission, the idea that crime could be organized not by tradition, but by consensus. That power could be shared rather than hoarded. That the old ways, no matter how deeply rooted, could be swept away in 48 hours of carefully orchestrated violence. Lucky Luciano proved that revolution doesn't always come from the powerless rising up. Sometimes it comes from the second in command, who sees further than his boss, thinks faster than his enemies, and has the ruthlessness to murder 40 men in 2 days to build something that will last 50 years. The ace of diamonds Joe Masseria died clutching is preserved in a New York police museum, a relic of a world that ended the moment he hit that checkered floor. 48 hours later, that world was completely dead, replaced by something colder, more efficient, and infinitely more dangerous. The old mafia died in September 1931. What rose from its corpse would haunt America for the rest of the century.